How does a bioethicist and historian get involved in this particular area?
uh, very carefully, I suppose.
Yeah.
Now, I was like a lot of people, very fascinated with this stuff when I was growing up. I read a lot about it. It was probably my favorite subject to read about, and in many ways, I have to say that it's kind of my interest as a young person, reading everything from Eric von Däniken to Carl Sagan and everybody in between that got me really interested in the idea of both history and the history of science and stuff like that. So I really cut my teeth, if you will, on this stuff growing up. But then I got interested in other things. But then several years ago, a colleague of mine was working on a project looking at what I didn't know was a thing that actually had happened, which was a kind of a mini revival of the occult in Europe after World War II. And I was asking her about, did that whole UFO thing take off in Europe at the time? And she's like, well, I don't really know about it. She said, maybe you ought to write something about it. I'm like, I don't have time for this stuff. I'm working on other things. And then I started doing what historians tend to do is I started looking at old newspapers. And there, lo and behold, was all this stuff in the 40s and 50s, particularly in Germany, about flying saucers. And I thought, boy, I had to look into this a little. And as I did, I just started to realize, hey, I think there's a book in there. I think it's been way too long that professional academic historians have not looked into this subject and have really not really gone into it in terms of writing an actual book about the entire sort of long history of this thing. And so I did. I just dove right in.
It's a really rich history. Even someone like myself who knows a lot about it, there's just so much stuff I'd never heard of, particularly globally. My focus, like so many Americans, has been in the kind of Western English speaking world of UFOs. Like they're clustering only in New Mexico and somewhere in England. But in fact, they've been all over South America and, other African countries and so on. Okay. Just as a point of interest here, since you are interested in the paranormal, a lot of skeptics often throw UFOs in with the supernatural and the paranormal, which I don't think is correct, because the idea of whatever they are, even the proponents are still operating in a materialistic world, that this is just science and technology more advanced than us. And it's not like the aliens are multidimensional beings, although some ufologists think so. But the idea that life evolved on some other planet and did what we did and got to be spacefaring civilizations and sent out von Neumann probes and whatever, and they're here. There's nothing paranormal or supernatural about that at all.
Right. And you could definitely make that argument. I think, some people have made the same argument about cryptozoology, right?
Mm.
That it's not necessarily paranormal because the idea is you can find some odd species of animals that were never seen before. So I'm sympathetic to that argument. I guess from my point of view, I'd point to two things. One is the aliens who were supposedly behind all this, from the perspective of many people who got interested in the subject, were always sort of seen as superhuman. Maybe they're not supernatural, but they're certainly superhuman. They have capabilities and they can do things like mind reading and communicating telepathically and all sorts of other kinds of powers that made them something way more than we are. I think the second thing is when you look at the history, is that it both fed into and really helped set in motion the kind of fascination of in the paranormal that's going to be a characteristic of the late 20th century for a lot of people in pop culture. And by the same merit, what happens is the UFO that gets folded into the paranormal world, right? By the 1970s, Sasquatch, telekinesis, ESP, cryogenics, UFOs, it's all sort of this big goulash, if you will, of the paranormal. So for me, it seems like it fits it fits into that mold because of the nature of the way the history played out.
Yeah, that's true. Remember that show, In Search of, starring Leonard Nimoy? They did a lot on UFOs, but every week it was something along those lines. The Bermuda Triangle and astrology and the Bigfoot and all that stuff. Yeah, it does get kind of lumped in there. I guess it might be considered esoterica or something like that. Although even that, something just came to mind when you were talking about aliens with extrasensory perception. Again, if the aliens are advanced enough, look what Elon's done with his Neuralink brain chips, where, the paralyzed person, I could just think a thought, the chip picks up the neural firings, sends a signal to the computer moves the cursor, and then the cursor can trigger the voice activation or whatever. I can imagine a century from now, there would be chips in my brain that could read the chips and communicate with the chips in your brain. This is Arthur C. Clarke's third law, right? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If you didn't know about the chips, it would look like ESP, but it's really just advanced technology. So you could even picture an alien technology of mind reading that's just technology.
Exactly, just technology, and the thing that you see historically, right, dating back from the very beginnings, is everybody who's looking into this phenomenon going on, and particularly people suspecting that aliens might be behind it, is they always project the existing technology that exists at the time onto the subject. So the only way to understand it is through available technologies, available scientific ideas and theories, sometimes things that are either on the margin or maybe seen as, these are the frontiers of where we are right now. But, it's interesting, just the other day, a colleague of mine or somebody I knew passed on an article that said, AI gives us a glimpse into the way the aliens might actually be, right? How they might exist. Maybe they're a version of AI. It's not a surprise that we would turn to what we know today and sort of see in that, maybe that's the model, maybe that's the template, right?
Yeah, like the airship UFOs of the 1890s, right around when airships were taking off and gliders and things like that, and then jets, and then rockets, and then, AI. That's the latest thing with SETI, that they're probably not using radio technology because, we're not even really going to bother to be using that anymore. So we should look on some other platform to find them, lasers or whatever. Or now, technosignatures, right? Avi Loeb,
Right.
it is, pieces of debris that entered the Earth's atmosphere might be technology, something like that. Yeah, it really is a reflection of what we care about. There are a few subjects I've covered more on this podcast that generate a lot of interest than UFOs and aliens. I've long been fascinated by it. Again, back to the Carl Sagan stuff and all that. It's people just love this. They can't seem to get enough of it. Why do you think that is? Just kind of a deeper, what's the mythology or religious like impulse, or I don't know, what is it that touches people's interest? Do you think?
Yeah. Well, I do think that at the heart of it, the famous Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, right, writes that book. His last book is on flying saucers in the late 50s, and I think he got a lot right in sort of looking at it. That it's hard not to see something in it that people find of spiritual significance. So there is a religious dimension to it. This idea of, particularly when you're talking about, right, this notion of, again, superhumans who are located or coming from the heavens, which are typically typically seen, right, as the sort of space that the divine inhabits. It's not a big reach to say that might be part of the reason why people become fascinated, and that clearly was the case. But I think that also neglects the fact that there are a lot of people who have been historically fascinated, utterly fascinated with the subject and the phenomenon, who have not seen in it any kind of religious or spiritual significance. They're fascinated with it as a mystery or some other reasons. And I think there too, you have to say that I think one of the major things is that it has a lot to do with our love-hate relationship with technoscience. It is the UFO and the beings that wherever they're coming from that are behind them as the way it plays out, right, are either extremely impressive and awe-inspiring, and maybe they're here to help us, or or they're giving us a glimpse of our own future, right? Or they're, of course, very, very scary. And in a sense, it's a great way, it's a very convenient way of through this indirect channel to really actually sit there and have conversations about what is it that we're doing, and are these really the ways we should be moving forward in the future. So particularly when say you look at particularly those early years after 1947, when people are asking themselves what this is all about, and if they're aliens, why are they here? I love that one of the first historical questions that arises at the time was, well, if they're here now, why did they come now? Like, why is it 1947, or why wasn't it 1932 or 1873? And the explanation that a lot of people came up with was nuclear weapons, atomic weapons. The aliens saw that we had really figured out the key to nuclear power, and they're afraid for us, or afraid for themselves, and see that as the kind of benchmark for an advanced civilization. So it's always, to me, been very much about how we sort of wrestle with our own history and our own future, or the way we imagine it to be, about science and technology.
Yeah. There's like a push and pull, positive, negative polls on these debates, like with AI. You have the Ray Kurzweil singularities coming, people, transhumanists, it's going to be great, it's going to change the world. Unlimited prosperity and energy and intelligence, and we get to live forever. And then you have the AI doomsayers on the other side, the Elons and the Stephen Hawkings and so on. Like, this is the most dangerous thing we've ever done. But that's an old theme, isn't it? Like back to Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein.
No, it is. That's spot on, right? I actually often teach Frankenstein in a lot of my science and medicine courses for that very reason, right? Because as you rightly say, it kind of creates this very convenient sort of narrative or myth around which we tend to build our stories about. Oh my God, why did we do this? And you're right. You look at it throughout the whole modern period, and every major new invention was a source of absolute delight and absolute dread, right? In the book, I talk about railways, right? Railroads as being an example of that in the 19th century. Right?
Yeah, it's like, speaking of earlier issues, here's volume 2, number 2 of Skeptic, way back in 1994. So we call this the Gort Pieta. That's Gort from The Day the Earth Stood Still, holding the Christ child. So we ran this long article by Steve Harris on science and science fiction and the kind of myth of immortality and resurrection myths in religion and science and so on. So he pointed out, for example, in the original Frankenstein, was it Boris Karloff? Was that who played?
Yeah.
Where they bring him to life through electricity, through lightning, right? So they put him on that gurney thing and they hoist him up to the top of the tower, and the lightning bolt. And then Dr. Frankenstein is standing there, is like, "It's alive! It's alive!" and so Steve points out that after that, he says, "Now I know what it feels like to be God." And that at that time they said, "Hey, we should not include that in the movie." So you can actually see him saying it, but they voiced over, or they cut the voice out and just had more electricity sound. And then he also pointed out in The Day the Earth Stood Still, which he says is a Christ allegory, because Klaatu comes and his earthly name is Mr. Carpenter, and he comes to Earth to talk to the officials. Yeah, I know, it's crazy. It's a great story. And, the authorities won't speak to him, so he mingles among the common people, and then the Patricia Neal character is sort of like a Mary Magdalene, where they kind of have this relationship, maybe. And then he meets with the scientists, and then the government authorities track him down and kill him. And remember, then she has to go to Gort the robot and give him the famous thing, Klaatu Barada Nikto, the most famous three words in all of science fiction, which is basically, go get him. He's in the morgue, right? The morgue, he's in the tomb, right? So Gort, zaps him out of the tomb, takes him back to the spaceship with Patricia Neal standing there, and puts him on that slab and pushes some buttons, and lights come on and sounds, and he wakes up. He comes back from the dead. And at that moment, in the original script, according to Steve Harris, she says, "Is this what the power of future science and technology has?" And he goes, "Yeah." And then the Breen Censorship Board at the time in 1951 said, we can't say that. So the new line was something like, no, that only the Great Spirit has that kind of power. This was just a temporary thing,
Yeah.
right? So then he gives his message, and then he ascends back to heaven in the spaceship. Basically warning your humans are being sinful, and you have to repent about your nuclear weapons. In the remake with Keanu Reeves, it was global warming. Again, reflecting exactly what you said. Whatever is our concern, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And if I'm not mistaken, I wish I could remember it exactly, but Mary Shelley experienced a similar thing with the first edition of her novel Frankenstein. That there was some let's say anger about the fact that there wasn't enough reference to the divine, to God in the novel, and it hinted at that. How could this scientist bring the dead to life without the intervention of God? So she had to, in subsequent edition, she had to actually introduce references to God to sort of assuage
Really? That's interesting.
the religious critics at the time.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. Yeah, that makes sense. Right. That's that tension again, always there. Well, there is something still mysterious about the life process. Your dog is bouncing around, he's happy, and then your dog is dead. It's the same. Atoms are still there. What? It's a process that just ceases. Why is that? So the idea of, well, electricity somehow must have something to do with it because of the frog leg twitching or whatever. Seems like at that time that was a process. Now it's more like AI or artificial intelligence somehow imbuing, but there's no life force. It's just a process.
Right.
But even, like the hard problem of consciousness, we still don't have a good explanation for that. You look up on the Wikipedia page under that problem, there's like 12 different explanations. And then to which my guest, Christoph Koch, who wrote a book about this, pointed out, yeah, but if you look up the page for quantum physics, you have the same thing, like 12 different interpretations of, quantum physics, the multiverse and all these things, and this double slit experiment. It's a mystery, right? So there's still enough like weird stuff. And we imagine the aliens maybe somehow figured this out. Consciousness and faster than light travel and, wormholes and multidimensional structures, whatever. It's all part of that mystery, I think, which makes it compelling.
And, it's a good point because it's interesting. I think of some my conversations with some scientists about the kind of work they do. And it was really interesting. I've asked some biologists, like, well, how do you guys define life? Like, you study life, the science of life. Most of them will tell me, oh, we never define it. We never have those conversations. Remember talking with a SETI scholar who said, I said, well, how do you guys define intelligence? He says, oh, we don't tend to think about that very much. A lot of fields, what you do is you kind of put it in a black box and say, well, we're just going to sort of assume certain things about it, but we know what we're studying. We're pretty confident about that we're getting good results about things, but the very thing that they're talking about often is left kind of murky or undefined because it's so messy. And that's why it's interesting that the people who often do that work, like consciousness, right? The people who often do that aren't, say, cognitive scientists. It's philosophers, right? Who are the ones who actually do that, the heavy lifting there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just recorded an episode with Sarah Walker. She does origins of life research at Arizona State. And so her new book is basically saying, we've been working on this problem, origins of life, for a century, and we really have not made that much progress. We need a completely different definition of life, physics, philosophy of science, of how we go about answering the problem. And I thought, wow, that's pretty gutsy to come right out and say it, because this is what the creationists have been saying for forever. You guys have not figured this out, ergo God or intelligent designer. So to have an insider, she's an atheist or whatever, to say, yeah, we have a problem, I think it's pretty honest.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I heard her give a talk about some of this before. So some of that was a little above my head because it got very technical. But that said, I got the basic drift of it. And I like you, I thought to myself, wow, this is really neat. This is really ambitious. So I'm eager to see sort of where that goes.
Yeah. Well, she works on assembly theory, and oh boy, if you try to follow it, it's beyond my pay grade, I guess. I don't know. I kind of have an idea about it, but okay. I don't know. To me, it seems like if you have all these scientists working on it and they still haven't figured it out, they probably need to do something else, something like a paradigm shift. And and back to the UFO stuff, I mean, in a way, it's reflecting that problem. We don't have an explanation. We don't know what they are, even after, let's say, a century now. And by that, I mean, like, just take the Chinese spy balloon. That was a UAP for a while, and then it wasn't. End of story. We know exactly what it was, where it came from. We have clear pictures and videos. The jet shot it down. We have the debris. End of story. Right? So there's no mythology about that. The mythology comes when under the uncertainty, right? We just can't quite make out what that was.
Right. It's the mystery of the, and I quote this in or at least cite him in my book, as this French sociologist by the name of Arnaud Esquer, who makes this really, really, I thought, really insightful, but it seems like a mundane point, but it's really, really quite insightful when he says that the fascination with UFOs lies not in the fact of their appearance, but their disappearance. It's not that UFOs are interesting because they pop up. It's that they then go away, right? This is the mystery. So how do we deal with the disappearance, right? And you look back, in the 1960s when Edward Condon puts together his scientific committee, right, over in Colorado to look into this. He says, right initially, he says, our big problem is these things don't stay put. We would love it if we could say, hey, there's a UFO out here. We'll get a quick action, team out there to go look into it. Says he can't do it. He compared it to an epidemic. He said, an epidemic, when it breaks out, it's still there when you get there, so you can look into it. And so I think that kind of aspect is what feeds the mysterious element here, that it's always kind of open-ended. And then the other part of it is that, of course, from almost the beginning, right, has been this idea that, yeah, we can explain a lot of this. Most any, right, and this, having talked with plenty of ufologists over the years, most really serious ufologists grant you that anywhere from 93 to 99% of things can be explained. They're fine with that. What it is always the residue problem, as Hynek always put it, right? It's the residue. There's this idea that there's this small number of things that just don't fit anywhere. And that's the stuff they say that we need to focus on, right?
Yeah. I think that's true in all fields. No scientific theory explains everything. So outsiders tend to hang on the anomalies. Okay, but you can't explain that one right there, Tuesday afternoon at 2:00. How about that one? Or, that thing over there in the woods that, whatever. And then, I don't know, to me, it feels like scientists should just say, it's okay to not explain something. It's just okay to say, I don't know. But I think it's like, this is my complaint about Anthony Fauci during the early days of the COVID. Just say, we don't know. And instead of making these definitive statements that turn out to be wrong, then it looks like you're lying or you're just an idiot. Just say, we don't know. Here's what we think this week. And we may tell you something different next week because the evidence is changing.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. Anybody who does serious research knows there's always stuff you don't know. And one of the mistakes you can make, and I'll tell you that is definitely true. You probably know this as well. If you're in front of a classroom teaching and you pretend you know something you don't know, the students usually catch you. And it's pretty embarrassing, but it also it undercuts, right, the integrity of the way in which you present information, or the sense that you are somebody who has done the hard work that has to be involved. So we always reach, and as you say, in every field, there's stuff we just don't know, or God knows every individual doesn't know everything. So I think that, the Fauci example is an interesting one, because it comes up too in the UFO world with people who've been over the years seen themselves or designated themselves as an expert, is that what it is there's a tension between, right, the work that you do to try to learn about a subject or learn about what you're doing. Then there's this public facing social role that you have to fulfill if you're, say, the head of Arrow or something like that, or that you want to fulfill, right? If you're kind of maybe a self-appointed expert, right? And what I feel constantly is a kind of pull in which so many people get drawn into that social world that leads them to go down avenues where they start staking out positions and saying authoritative things that really you can't say. You can't say it with that kind of conviction. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong. And it's a very strong pull. I mean, I've felt it over the years working on this project when people ask me to chime in about things. And I try to, as I try to say to everybody, I try to stay in my lane. I'm a historian. I'm not an
Yeah.
engineer. I'm not an
Yeah.
astrophysicist, right?
You did a great job of that book. I really had no idea. Still have no idea. I might ask you at the end here. What do you really think? I'm in the position of both positions. Historian of science and
Yeah.
And an intellectual interested in the psychology of belief, and also the publisher of a magazine that's supposed to pronounce. Well, what do we know? What is it true or not? Right. So there is a kind of a social pressure to say something like UFOs are not real, whatever that would mean. And when I couch it in, well, it depends on how you are asking the question, because when I'll say something like, I don't think aliens have visited Earth, a typical response I'll get is, so you're saying we're alone in the universe? Like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I would be shocked if we're alone in the universe. I'm sure they're out there. I just don't think they've come here. So there's two different questions, right? And then I try to give it like a Bayesian. Well, let's just put it like 80% or 90%, or, it's a 1% probability it could be aliens. That allows you to then change your mind. Like, well, okay, if you show me new evidence, I'll change my priors and I'll give it 2% or 5% or whatever, something like that. But people aren't used to hearing that. Again, back to the Fauci thing. I just think public officials like him are not used to telling the public, in a Bayesian way, here's the odds that we think it is at the moment. And this is one of my complaints about science in the media. And the media tends to think people can't read graphs. They don't understand probabilities and numbers and statistics. This is nonsense. Look at the sports page. It's loaded with graphs and data and charts and averages and percentages. The weather pages, the business stock market graphs and charts. People understand that. I just don't like that. The media seems to talk down to the public when it comes to some scientific issues.
Yeah, though I'd push back a little bit when it comes to meteorology, right?
Oh, meteorology. Okay. Oh, right.
Talk to any weather person and they'll tell you about all the hate email and hate phone calls they get, right?
That's
when they
true.
say a 20% chance of rain and then it rains on their picnic and they go, you told me it was 20%. And he goes, do you know what we mean when we say it's
That's
20%?
true. They don't know. No.
The weather people are probably the folks who could probably tell us both that that's not true. But I agree with you that the thing is that I on the other hand, I think that what people have, and again, this is you could say this is the public relation problem that science in the modern world has had ever since it sort of has tried to inhabit the public arena in a way a lot of science didn't do. I mean, really, that notion of science really being an institution, a group of experts communicating directly with the public is it's certainly a modern phenomenon, and it's relatively new. I think a lot of what we associate it with is a phenomenon of the early 20th century. So what you see, and again, go back to the UFO stuff, I think of somebody again like Edward Condon, who I talk about in the book, who was doing this study. The thing that he kept pointing to at the end when it all just came crashing down on him was he said, I had no clue and no idea about what I was getting into when it came to public relations. He had no training in it, certainly at the time. He was not ready for it. And so he was making statements without any sense of how that might be interpreted, right, or understood by the public at large. And media is a mediating institution, right? It has its own narratives. And so I get it. It's complicated for people who are out there to figure out, how do I do this? But you're quite right. The question is there a better way to do it than the way it's often done, right?
By the way, from my library, I pulled a few books off the shelf here.
Uh,
The Condon
that,
Report. Look at the size of that thing.
you got and you got the hardback.
Yeah, I
That's a
got the
beauty.
hardback, and
That's
then
a
I got
beauty.
George Adamski's "Flying Saucers Have Landed."
Oh,
Look at
that's
this thing with
great.
the little ping pong balls.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
And the Hynek Report by J. Allen Hynek.
yeah,
By the way, his son Paul Hynek is kind of keeping his memory alive. Paul is a
yeah.
professor at Pepperdine University. Oh, you probably
Right.
met him. You probably talked to him. Yeah.
I've
And
never
inside the
met him, but I
spaceships,
wanted to.
George
Oh, yeah.
Adamski, he went inside the spaceships,
Right.
flying saucers from outer space. Oh, Donald Kehoe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a fan donated. Well, actually, I think it was the Amazing Randy sent me all these books that he had collected over the decades. And finally, since you discussed this was a classic. Martin Gardner in the
Martin
Name of
Gardner's The Name of
Science,
Science.
which later
Yep.
became Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science. Yeah,
Right.
you know that the Martin Gardner thing. Since you discussed that in the book, that is kind of the start. That's where I put the start of the modern skeptical movement as a activist group pushing back against New Age claims, including UFO stuff. And you know, I think it was in your book you talked about the founding of it between Paul Kurtz and Marcello Truzzi. That was yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
So
Yep.
I knew those guys. Truzzi was much more of a kind of sociologist of science. Let's just take a neutral perspective here and keep it scholarly. And Paul Kurtz was like, no, we are debunkers, because there's a lot of bunk. And also, I love that discussion in your book about the word debunking. I had no idea where that came from.
Yeah.
You just tell us that. Tell us that one.
Yeah, well, the word came, the term debunking is invented by, I think it might have been a journalist or some sort of writer in the 1920s, but it originated from an older English term, bunkum, which,
Mm,
you know, is
yeah.
like hokum and things that are not true, right? And so debunking was to take the bunkum out of things,
I
and
love
that's where
that.
the term debunking comes. So debunk, the term itself, yeah, is only about 100 years old, which is kind of surprising. Yeah. But that's fascinating. I mean, I was utterly fascinated with
Oh, yeah, there
that
it is. American
debate.
journalist
Yeah,
William Woodward. This is from your
William
book.
Woodward. Yeah,
1923, originally meant to
right.
refer back to a couple of older terms, bunk and bunkum. Yeah, nice.
Yeah,
Humbug,
yeah.
humbug or nonsense.
Humbugger nonsense.
Yeah, it's hard to know where to put different categories. You know, there's all these sightings that you talk about that I assume people are being honest when they say, I really saw something. I just cannot explain it. Versus someone like George Adamski. I was in the spaceship. Really? Come on. I just can't. I can't go. This is just bullshit, and I'm going to call it that. There you have those kind of decisions a decision tree at each one of the different claims. This is in the kind of legitimate, I saw something. They probably did see something. They're not delusional. They're not mentally ill. They're not lying. They're not just bullshitting to write a book or whatever. There really are mysteries that they're baffled by.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I always think there's always a set of distinctions that need to be made between, witnesses, between witnesses who describe something, people who report something, people who write about something. All of those things, to me at least, as a historian working on it, are really important distinctions. The one thing I've often said is I think all the evidence shows that the vast majority of people who had sightings, I think we're always operating in good faith.
Yeah.
I think most of them were just people who just, they see something weird and they're like, I don't know what this is. And we know that the vast majority of them never actually even reported to anybody, maybe a friend or a family member, but that's it. So we don't even see or hear about the number of people who probably have that kind of experience, right? When you start to have people like a George Adamski, who not only make extraordinary claims, but what they do is they narrate it in terms of, I don't know how many pages that book is of his that you have in front of you, but right, several hundred pages
Yeah.
of narrative
Yeah.
about
250
what that
pages.
is. So
Yeah.
most people who have an experience of what we would associate with a UFO don't have 250 pages in them about what that experience was, right? That is a different order of phenomenon when you're looking at it as I do socially, right? And
Yeah.
so he plays a different role, and right, and now in the case of Adamski, he adopts the role of a prophet, right?
Yeah.
He's heard from these superhuman beings. They're here to save us, and he sees himself as their spokesperson for that purpose, right?
Yeah. Here's his last paragraph of the book on page 251. To the brothers of other worlds, human beings like ourselves, I am grateful for what they have shown and taught me. To my brothers in this world, I report, knowing that many are ready. As always, the skeptics must wait for what, even to them, will be overwhelming proof that space has been conquered by peoples from planets far advanced beyond our own. And then he signs it, George Adamski. Yeah, that was back in the day when people, the authors would sign the last page of the book. That's great. Yeah.
No.
I don't know if he's, mentally ill or whatever. I mean, I just can't believe. I mean, if he said this came to me in a dream, maybe it's sleep paralysis or something like that. But that's not what he's saying.
Well, in the case of Adamski, he had a fairly long history before any of this took place of deep involvement in theosophy, in esoterica and things like this. And as I talk about in the book, even before he has this supposed set of experiences of meeting this man from Venus, right, and then later other planets, right? He is himself very fascinated with science fiction and actually writes some science fiction. And all throughout, the one common thread you see is this thread of all of this connects to his moral philosophy, his metaphysical, mystical view of spirituality. That is the constant here. And people at the time who were even critics of him said, I think maybe what he is he's sincere in the sense that he wants to see in the UFO phenomena, as a lot of people did in the 1950s, see it as some sort of portent of this new age, and he sees this as an opportunity to get his message across. And so you could be very cynical about it and say he just exploits the opportunity and lies about it, or you could say some people did, he sort of deludes himself into thinking that's the case. Other people will say, no, he's having a genuine spiritual experience, and he's viewing it through the lens of this, religious philosophy that he's had by that time for decades, right?
Yeah, that probably is a more generous interpretation. I'm a little harsh on that. I suppose you might see it as something like those visual illusions, like the young woman, old woman, or the rabbit and the duck. Where it's one of these ambiguous figures, and depending on what you're thinking about, or if there's an audio track, it tells, or a visual of what the words are, and then the audio is ambiguous, and then you hear it, whatever it is, words you're seeing, and so on. There, it only works if it's ambiguous. You just can't quite make out. Then whatever it is you're thinking about, you're primed. You primed yourself, or culture primes you, or the cognitive psychologist who's running the experiment primes you, and then you interpret it that particular way. That I could see. Yeah, that makes more sense. And certainly the context you put it in of what was going on in the 50s and 60s, that does make more sense contextually.
Yeah. I mean, again, there were plenty of critics of George Adamski, right? Oh, pretty fast. And that is within the UFO world, right? And probably the best known for anybody who knows that history is Jim Moseley, the famous sort of the gadfly.
I knew him in the 90s.
Yeah.
He reached out to us when we started Skeptic magazine. You guys got to cover UFOs, and he gave us a subscription to Saucer Smear.
Yeah.
It's like he was a character.
He was a character. I really wish I had begun this project much earlier so I could have met him, because he sounds like a pretty interesting guy. But, back in the 50s, he's the one who publishes this big expose about Adamski, interviews some of the people who supposedly were there, and he pokes holes in so many things. And he's the one who says, when I first met him, I thought he's a sincere guy. And he said, when I finally start digging around, I don't know that I believe he's sincere anymore. I think Adamski was making it up. I think he was lying about some things because there's just too many contradictions and too many uncomfortable contradictions in the things that he said were going on compared to other people. Arthur C. Clarke was another one who just utterly skewered Adamski and his story at the time. Yeah.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. There's this line of demarcation between science and pseudoscience, which is often arbitrated by the people themselves that are in the different sort of boxes between there. Here, an example would be in the 9/11 truther movement. There are those, that think that the planes hit the building and explosive devices were planted in. And then people like me irritatingly point out, how did they know which floors exactly that the planes were going to hit ahead of time to, climb up there and plant the explosive devices in the right floors at the angle where the planes hit? Well, one solution is by the no planers. There were no planes. These are all CGI, to which the normal 9/11 truthers go, well, that's just crazy. No, that's a crazy conspiracy theory.
That's a crazy conspiracy theory.
Which reminds me of that book, The Three Christs of Ypsilanti, the psychologist at Ypsilanti Mental Health, that was in Michigan, I think, mental institution. He had 3 different patients each of who thought he was Christ. So he got all 3 of them in a room at the same time, and each of them said, these 2 other guys have lost their minds. They're delusional. So, something like that. I was thinking of Bob Lazar, who claims that he worked at Area 51 and, and he saw the back engineering, the UFOs and so on. But he also said he went to Caltech and MIT, and it was another ufologist whose name escapes me now, who's the nuclear physicist. Who was that guy?
Was it Friedman?
Friedman. Yeah. I was on Larry King Live with him. He was an interesting character, but an honest guy. He did, because he had a legitimate degree in nuclear physics, and he didn't like that this guy was making up his degrees. So now there's this whole conspiracy theory about how they went and erased the records of Bob Lazar as a student at MIT and Caltech. It's like, well, who's the they? Well, So you can't go into MIT and Caltech records and just erase people. How would that even happen? Anyways, but the point is that he was exposed by Friedman himself, who was a pro ufologist, and that kind of I always like to bring that up because it's like he's on your team, and he said it was.
Oh, and again, there's a long history of that stuff. There's a really long history of that stuff within the whole ufology world of. And part of it is rooted in, I think, again, I chronicle, I think, plenty of people in the book who were, I think, the term that you often hear used is a serious ufologist. That is to say, somebody who really tries to get it right, doesn't think every claim is accurate or every claim should be afforded the same amount of respect or legitimacy, right? Who try to draw distinctions, who are interested in bringing some rigor to it, and then people who maybe are far less discriminating in what they will accept as evidence. That had been around already since the 1950s. And so some of that is rooted in that kind of sort of self-criticism within the field. But of course, we also know that what also exists in the field has been acrimony, right? A lot of back and forth between personalities who don't get on with one another, petty jealousies, incriminations, right, laid against people, talking about how they mishandled funds or are abrogating too much to themselves. You get a lot of that as well. But again, what organization or group doesn't have things like that happen? So the UFO world has over those decades, right, had all of these different sort of tensions and pulls and pushes, right, that have part of that's what I was trying to do in the book was try to get it, not why is this stuff so powerful, but I sometimes think the question is, why didn't it all just fall apart? Because there's just so many different moving parts with so many different people coming at it from so many different angles. There seems to me to be lots of reasons to feel that the the centripetal forces would have just had all this stuff just dissipate and go away. And at different times it looked like it was going to do that, right? That all these groups and organizations were just going to all collapse and people were losing interest, and then it all comes together again. So 2017 is a good example of that, right? All seemed to be kind of moribund, right? And then all of a sudden there it was again. Yeah.
That was, you're referring to the New York Times article by Leslie Kean. Yeah. Yeah, I always make the point that, because people always reference the New York Times released this. They said it was true or real. It's like, hang on, who wrote that article? Well, Leslie Kean, she's a longtime ufologist, and Blumenthal, who wrote the biography of the alien abduction guy,
John Mack,
and so on. It's like, okay, this isn't like the New York Times assigned our crack journalists to get out there and get to the heart of this, and they made this big discovery. This. All right, but there is something about the New York Times reporting on it that, again, culturally and historically makes a difference. This isn't saucer smear. This is the New York Times, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
that does make a big difference there. Yeah, I was amazed in reading your book how many different UFO groups there were. I never even heard of a lot of them. And, they have a little newsletter and, they had a membership of 200 people and then they ran out of money. There's so much of that.
It was... and I come away, this probably happens with all historians up to a point, depending on your subject matter, of course, but invariably you kind of get close to those historical actors you're looking at, and it's hard for me to not have a good deal of admiration for a lot of these people who were working and doing this stuff, particularly in those early decades. I mean, everybody's doing it in their free time. I mean, outside of Donald Kehoe, nobody's doing this stuff as a professional, right? You're not making any money. You're spending your own money to keep all this stuff together. You're then having none of these newsletters and periodicals. They're not on newsstands. They're all subscription. And all of these organizations, when you read in the archival stuff, they're always ending their newsletters with like, okay, people, like 7 of you have put your annual subscription in. I've already borrowed, $100 from my father to do this. Would you please send in your subscription money? And what a lot of them would do in order to both keep up with, UFO news from across the world, and also deal with this problem in part, was to trade in periodicals and newsletters. So, an organization in New York would agree to an organization in, say, Detroit. Hey, we'll send you our monthly newsletter. You send us yours. Nobody has to pay any subscriptions. You out there in Buenos Aires, you send us your newsletter. We'll send you ours. And so you have this kind of trade that's going on that's pretty impressive when you think that people are all doing this in the 50s and 60s when that was not a simple thing to do, right? And postage costs something, right? So
pre-internet days.
Pre-internet days.
You actually have to go to the post office and mail these things. Did you have, in your research, did you find a lot of the physical copies of these newsletters?
Oh, yeah.
How fun.
And again, they're really remarkable. It's very clear, like some people were using those. We're old enough to remember it. The young people, mimeograph, right? That mimeograph machine. And so a lot of, especially for some of them that don't last long, or they're the early days of publishing, the ink isn't really, setting. So you can't even make out some of the words on the page. Of course, they've got typos because people are typing these things out. But there really are remarkable, chronicles of what people are up to, because there's a lot of very, very, what I find fascinating is very local news, right? They're interested in things that are going on around them. They're interested in the sort of the big events. So, everybody covers Adamski, everybody covers Donald Kehoe, but you're also hearing about what's going on in that small town in upstate New York, or in somewhere in Michigan. That to me is kind of cool, because you get this sense of, a very small community of people who really care about this, and they really thought we're doing something that's going to make a difference in the world. We are at the cutting edge of something really, really momentous. And in the end, you think to yourself, well, who wouldn't want to be part of something like that's historically unique, right, and unprecedented?
Well, you've met and talked to, I'm sure, Jill Tarter and Seth Shostak at the SETI Institute. I mean, it's the same drive. I mean, you listen to them; they're passionate. Like, we could make the greatest discovery in the history of science, if not of all of humanity. We're not alone in the universe. What would not be compelling about that? And the UFO people, I mean, that they kind of have the same motivation, just a different avenue toward it.
Yeah, I agree, and I do talk about that in the book. That I know the SETI people historically have had to sort of keep the UFO world and the UFO talk sort of at arm's length, and you see that in the very early years of the SETI stuff, right? Of the stuff in Frank Drake's work and all those folks in Green Bank. They're knowing they're talking about something that a lot of colleagues are uncomfortable about, and of course they got a lot of blowback from colleagues, and they have for even to this day. I talk to SETI people, and even to this day, they get blowback from colleagues who say, "I just don't see the point of all this nonsense," right? But you're quite right that the two communities, even though they didn't tend to intersect very much, they shared a lot historically in common with one another. One being this idea: we might be the people to make this momentous discovery. The other thing is historically they tend to kind of share similar politics when you look at their politics. So we know from some of the records and some of the comments made by the people who were involved in SETI, say in the 1960s, that they in the 70s they really saw themselves as this project that was going to be, all about science that is not sponsored by the military. It's the science, it's the pure science that is all about discovery, and it's all about seeing us all as human beings, that we don't draw distinctions between the Soviet Union and America, right? There's that famous meeting between Soviet scholars and SETI scholars in America, right, in Armenia in the 1970s. And they saw, Drake talks about it, says, we were thinking this is a model for bringing peace on Earth. Like, we're going to set up radio telescopes in the Middle East, and it's going to bring peace to the Middle East, right? And a lot of UFO people back in that same period of time would have said much the same thing, that what we are is about, we're about cooperation, we're about peace, we're about seeing us as all united. A very kind of common sort of theme that oftentimes both groups very, very skeptical and outright cynical, say, about the military and the Air Force, right, and its work on UFOs.
Yeah, Avi Loeb talks about this a lot on the Galileo project. I'm their sort of token skeptic on the team. So we have these Zoom meetings every Friday. By the way, Stephen Dick is part of the team also.
Oh, right.
And I plugged your book a few weeks ago, held it up, and Stephen's like, "Oh my God, I've been reading that book." You must have sent him a preprint or something. It's a great book. It's the best history of the UFO, the whole
that's
thing.
Great.
And I think that's true. I agree. I don't have to write the book now. I've always wanted to write that book. I don't have to do it now. It's been done. But the phenomenon surrounding Avi has been interesting to watch, because on the Zoom meetings and when he talks to me privately or on the podcast, he's very careful. He's very skeptical. He wants to be like Carl Sagan, kind of. They could be. I'm just trying to search. I'm just an open-minded scientist. But the media doesn't treat him like that. He thinks he's found it. Right. They are here. We have made contact. And that's why they go to his office. He has film crews in his office every week. Netflix is making a special documentary on his life. And, all these other scientists that have been working in this area, they don't get that kind of attention. There's something about just kind of the way he phrases things, or he'll throw one sentence in a paper. saying, this, the signs of techno signatures, as they're called.
Yeah.
These particular little spherules that we found at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean contain these ratio of elements that could indicate it's a techno signature. Because when he first said he's going to go trolling for these artifacts, I thought he was going to dredge up the dashboard of the Millennium Falcon or something. Oh my God, there it is.
There it is.
There's a speedometer.
We've got it.
But
yeah,
nothing
exactly.
like that. Again, it's right in that kind of gray area. So I asked chemists or whatever, what about this ratio of these? Well, maybe not. It's like, again, here we go. Can't quite make it out. It's like the blurry photographs and grainy video. If you squint and use your imagination, you can sort of see. It's like, come on.
No, doesn't work that way. Yeah, I mean, two things. One is, about science. The way science works is that I'm always saying this to colleagues who work in this area, and especially to people who are not practicing scientists or scholars, is that if you want us academics to get into this, to actually take it seriously and study it, then be prepared for the way we do our work. First of all, it's slow. It's very, very slow. Secondly, we always begin and end in skepticism, because that's the way we work. Skepticism is the beginning point, right? It is the middle point, is the end point. You're always having to question the work you're doing and the assumptions and the methods you're using, right? And then the third thing is, as you know, with science qualifies every statement, right? Everything's qualified. That's the part that I think gets lost with the media. The media is not, it goes back to our topic before, right? The media is not very good with qualifications, right? Whether it's percentages, right, or accepting certain priors, all that stuff tends to get lost in the shuffle there. I think in terms of Avi Loeb, I mean, again, when I approach these things, and the thing that interests me is to look at certain figures and certain points in time, and how certain people sort of assume certain positions and other people come to the fore and other people disappear. Avi Loeb, some people have asked me, well, have we ever had anybody like Avi Loeb before? And I think, well, I think you'd have to say J. Allen Hynek kind of was a similar character. Very different personalities, right? Hynek really was even while he made some pretty bold claims, he also tended to hedge his bets quite a bit. And he is a personality, right? He kind of, I don't know. I don't know how your read of Hynek was. He struck me as a kind of embraced the persona of the little sort of geeky professor. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think Avi Loeb is more of a firebrand. I mean, he's got a big personality, and I think that's part of his that charisma is part of why he's so successful in the media in a way that other people have, I think, a lot more difficult time doing. Right.
Yeah. Also, he's looking here on Earth rather than, say, Sarah Walker and these other people looking for biosignatures and exoplanets. The planet passes in front of the star between us and the star, and the light goes through the atmosphere. Maybe there's some methane gas or some other CO2 gases that indicate there could be living organisms. Yeah. Even if they made that discovery, this is not going to be like on Ancient Aliens History Channel series, right? It's like, well, it's just some chemicals in an atmosphere. We want aliens here. Just show us. They've been here. That seems to be the big tipping point there.
Yeah. And you need, again, another point I make in the book is that plenty of people over the decades are interested in, what's called in the UFO world, nuts and bolts stuff. They're interested in, figuring out, how do these things propel themselves? What's their source of propulsion, right? We want hardware. Show us the hardware. What could the hardware look like? We even know back in the 60s, right, that some of the big aeronautic companies were trying to build flying saucers to see if they were viable, right? But the thing that's driven this stuff more than anything has not been that. It's really been drama. And as you say, yeah, things like that are not very dramatic. There's not a lot to invest you. Human interest stories have been far more compelling in that regard. And so people have wanted, and I think needed, storylines to be able to follow. And that is the stuff that, of course, draws, I think, a lot of people into UFOs. And sometimes that storyline is about people who have bizarre experiences seeing a UFO of what's called high strangeness, or it's a George Adamski story about I met the aliens, or it's the conspiracy theory, like they're men in black who are intimidating people. Those elements are that, and those kinds of aspects of things play into this drama or melodrama that I think is a very big characteristic aspect of the whole history of the UFO phenomenon.
So much of your book deals with this bottom-up emergent social system that has driven this spontaneously, no one's directing it, and so on. But there is a top-down interest by governments who have always had crash retrieval programs. I mean, the British were very interested in the crashed V2 rockets to see what it is they were, right. So let's back engineer that. How did they do this? And then, of course, through Project Paperclip, we absconded with a bunch of those Nazi scientists and brought them to New Mexico and said, do here what you were doing over there in Peenemünde.
Yeah, right.
We want some of that, right?
You don't just have crash retrieval. You have scientist retrieval.
Retrieval,
right?
yeah.
Let's get who needs the artifact? We'll get the guys, right? Yeah,
I don't know if you ever read Annie Jacobson's book on the Operation Paperclip. If you had a paperclip on your file, it means you get to go to the United States and be part of the scientist program, rather than you go to Nuremberg and be put on trial for war crimes. Because a lot of the guys, like all the way up to what's his name, head of the Apollo program,
Wernher von Braun.
Wernher von Braun. He probably would have been convicted for war crimes had he just been sent off to Nuremberg, right? I mean, he knew about the slave labor at Peenemünde and so on. But, she points out that there was a competition because if we didn't get him, the Russians were going to get him. Right. So there is political government interest in all these topics.
Yeah. The political government aspect of things is, I guess it was inevitable, right? Because, and again, I think, it is fair to talk about it as I do, and most historians who have dipped a toe in this talk about it, that all this stuff is very much linked to the Cold War. I certainly believe the UFO phenomenon as we understand it is absolutely inflected by that deep history with the Cold War. But what people, I think, forget, and you mentioned it here just when you mentioned the V2 rocket, right, is that this stuff takes off right after World War II. I mean, that is not like ancient history to people. People have very, very vivid, and if you are in places like Europe or Japan, you have traumatic memories of things from the skies dropping on you, killing your family, injuring people, destroying property. That stuff is really still very, very much alive in people's minds. So when all this stuff is taking place, it's not at all strange that government gets involved and says, what's going on? And it's not strange that people start thinking the first thing in their minds is, what are governments playing with now? They kept this atomic weapon thing secret. We didn't know about it. And look what they did. I'll bet you these flying saucers are the newest thing. And what are they? And so one of the things you see is that a lot of people in Europe are really angry in the late 40s when nobody knows what these things are, but they suspect it's either the Soviets or the Americans. And they're really upset. They're saying, here's these two superpowers, and they're experimenting with these new devices. And how do we know they're not going to kill us? They don't care. They don't care about us Europeans, right? So there is this instantaneous interest of government in investigating who might be responsible, and at the same time, this resentment on the part of a lot of people in the public who say, government should come clean and tell us what they know about these things. Because we know you're playing around with dangerous stuff, and we don't want to be, the cannon fodder for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, because there's enough truth to those things. Like
Yeah,
conspiracy theories, one reason people believe them is because there's a lot of conspiracies. The governments and corporations
yeah,
do things in secret. They really do. Right? I
yeah,
mean, like the U-2 spy plane was developed right in Burbank, California, at the Lockheed Skunk Works, like a
yeah.
mile from where Johnny Carson filmed The Tonight Show, right? I mean,
Wow.
all that happened and no one knew it was there. And then they'd box it
Wow.
up and drive it out Highway 10, 15 up to Nevada
Yeah.
to the Area 51. Okay, so that turned out to be true.
Right. I know, right? Yeah. So, and you have plenty, and of course, we know that the CIA admits in the mid '90s that, well, you know what, we did sometimes lean into the UFO narrative because it kept people from looking at the things like the U-2 plane, right, or other kinds of things. It's kind of interesting. Some time ago, I don't know if you've read Garrett Graff's book
I did. Yeah.
about
Yeah.
UFOs, and I had a chance to talk with him, and he made it, I thought, a really interesting point about conspiracies. Is that he said, you know, conspiracy. There's only two ways conspiracies work. You can have a big conspiracy involving a lot of people, but you can only have it for a short period of time. And his example is D-Day, right? D-Day
Yes.
was a big conspiracy, but you could not keep that secret for a long period of time. It was a very short period of time because too many people knew about it. And then he says you can have a small conspiracy for a somewhat lengthier period of time, right? And I can't remember offhand what his version of that was. So there are versions of conspiracy that are out there. None of them tend to have very long lives, though, right?
Yeah.
They all eventually get revealed in one form or another.
Here's what he told me on my podcast here
Yeah,
about that. The challenge for me with government conspiracies is they presuppose a level of competence that is
yeah,
not on display in the rest of the work that the government does. I just don't believe the government is capable of keeping a secret at scale like this for any meaningful period of time. For example, my next book is a history of D-Day, Operation Overlord, the biggest, most important secret that the U.S. government had. They had 6, 8, 10 complete breaches of secrecy in the 6 or 8 months before. One guy literally accidentally mailed a copy of the invasion plans to his mom in Chicago. One officer got drunk and accidentally started talking about the invasion at a cocktail party.
yeah,
Another officer left a briefcase behind on a bus that he ended up chasing down down the street trying to recover the invasion documents. That's one operation in one 6-month period. So to me, I just don't see the capability of the U.S. government to keep any meaningful secrets about a UFO program over a long period of time. And you have conspiracy around UFOs that would employ thousands of people over decades, and not one has leaked anything or left a briefcase full of UFO secrets in an Uber, and so on.
yeah, yeah,
It's so
yeah.
good.
And I can't remember if it was him or somebody else. He might have mentioned, but I've heard somebody else made the point too. When you had the fall of the Soviet Union, and all of these, you know, for at least a brief period of time before Putin came into power, there was this access to all sorts of Soviet records. There was lots of transparency. Let's let all the secrets out. That's where you might have also suspected a
Yeah.
lot of documents to come out and somebody saying, hey, we now have all of these records from the Soviet Union and the Soviet military revealing this stuff, and none of it came out, right? None of it
Yeah.
came out, which sort of bears out this idea that there's not a lot to this conspiracy aspect of things, right?
Yeah. Well, the Nazis were the first to develop jet engines and jets and rockets, but we know about them because we have the equipment, we have the scientists who developed them, and so on. That became clear, and we then back engineered and developed the same technology within a few years. Just like the Russians got a nuclear weapon within 3 years
Yeah,
of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Basically, they stole our plans,
yeah.
right? So you either back engineer or you copy or you just steal the plans of another company or government. That's normally how it happens. That's why I don't think
Mm.
UAP videos can represent like super advanced Chinese or Russian technology that we have no idea how to build. That just isn't how it works. I mean, everybody steals each other's secrets. Everybody knows about what level everybody else is at. The examples I use would be like everybody has the same level of, say, jets and jet engines and rockets. They're all pretty much the same. I mean, Elon made a big advancement there by being able to land the rocket after launch. That was a huge thing. But now, now everybody knows how it can be done, so other people will do it. or Apple and all the other Samsung. The smartphones are all pretty much the same, even though they have property rights and copyrights and patents and all that stuff. It's just no one gets very far ahead of anybody else. So, and you would see the Russians using this technology if they had it in Ukraine, but we don't see anything like that.
Yeah.
Right. So that tells me that it's probably not that. It's probably not aliens, probably not foreign assets that we don't have. It's probably more the mundane things. Although I'm always leery that the DARPA program, they're always working on something. And then like 10, 20 years after the fact, we find out about it, like the stealth bomber, like, oh, look at that Delta Wing thing. And they have this special paint. I forget how much it costs, but it's like $30,000 just to paint the thing, right?
Right.
Because it doesn't reflect light. And I've actually seen this thing fly over when I lived in Pasadena. They would bring it out from Edwards Air Force Base on January 1st and fly over the Rose Parade.
Uh-huh.
And the thing would come right up over my house, and man, it was really spooky, like almost like a triangular hole in the sky because there's no light, right? And when it comes at you, it doesn't make any sound. You don't hear the sound till it goes past you.
Oh, wow!
Yeah, it's pretty spooky. Of course, we all knew about it, and we're looking forward to seeing it. But if you didn't know, and it was dusk, and you're out in the desert, and you saw this thing, sure, that would be a UFO.
Oh my God! Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You've never seen anything like it.
Right.
I still remember when I gave a public talk and about stuff, and a guy told me that he was in the Air Force, in the military, and they were flying. This is back in the late 50s or early 60s or something, and he said, we were there, and way above us we saw a UFO. And this thing is moving so fast. And he said we could not figure out what the heck it could be. He says years later, they realized they had caught sight of a U-2 plane. And they're flying at what? Probably 30,000 feet.
And that thing's up at 70.
Could go up to 70.
Yeah.
And it's going so damn fast, right?
Even faster was the SR-71 Blackbird was even faster, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
It went across the United States in like an hour. Something like 3,000 miles an hour.
So, and if you don't know about the existence of this thing. And so, of course, you're going to sit there and go, I think we'll put this in the UFO bucket because it fits in the UFO bucket. Yeah.
There was a Star Trek episode of the original series where the Enterprise gets slung back in time and they land they end up in the atmosphere of the Earth in like 1965, right? So the Air Force scrambles jets and the guy goes, "Oh my God, it's a UFO." And it really was.
Yeah, it really was. I remember that one.
So you never know. Right. Okay, now in terms of determining the cause of flaps and waves, I like this discussion in your book. So a flap is more of a short-term, local cluster or sequence of sightings, and a wave is a larger geographical and longer in time?
Right. So at different points in the book, I talk a little bit about flaps and waves, right? Because this also has plays a big role in the history of the UFO phenomenon. These sort of punctuated moments of concentrations of reported sightings that happen in different locations, and sometimes they are outright international, like in say 1953 or 1973, times like that. And in any event, one of the things that I think is that I try to point out is that it's really important when you hear about things like flaps and waves and about lots of sightings is you're never talking about sightings. You're talking about reports of sightings. Hey, J. Allen Hynek himself said multiple times on the record, we don't study sightings, we study reports. To get to a report, right, is something different than a sighting. A sighting, somebody has an experience, but then it has to get reported. And the report itself is a mediation. It's a form of taking the information down. Who knows who's doing it? Is it a qualitative conversation like we're having, or is there a form? Whose form is it? Is the interviewer taking good notes or lousy notes? So all of that goes into the report. And so the question is then, why do we have elevated numbers of reports at times and then downturns? And explanations over the years have been given for that. I mean, there are people who say, well, there are times when there's an intense concentration of UFOs in the area and that they're there for a reason, maybe surveillance or stuff. But probably the most common one has been to look at media. And one of the things I talk about is film. A lot of people have made the argument that what happens is movies come out or there's some new book on a subject, and that what it does is it sort of triggers a lot of sightings, right? The record on that actually, I think, is fairly ambiguous, and if sometimes not outright contradictory in that regard. The big wave that happens in 1952 in the United States wasn't preceded by any major film during that time. When you look at the wave in the United States and then expands to other parts of the world in 1973, once again, there was no big blockbuster movies or television program about UFOs that would have triggered that kind of thing. And even after certain films come out, say 1977, and you have Spielberg's Close Encounters film, what seems to have been the case was it didn't trigger an uptick in new sightings. What it triggered is a bunch of people coming forward saying, oh, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I had a sighting. And now maybe I think it might be one of these things. So waves and flaps seem to have a kind of almost organic nature to them. But the thing I think that plays a key role is usually the media. Local media often are the key to those things, and then national and international press agencies then take hold of these sometimes, and then are the ones who sort of cobble together this idea that we've experienced a wave or a flap. So I think media plays a really, really big role in what gets defined as a wave and a flap, and how it sort of gets how it sparks into something beyond just some sort of local concentrated set of reports and reported sightings.
Yeah, or it could be a combination or interactive effect. Maybe there's a wave or a flap, and then some screenwriter says, hey, that might make a good story for a film. And then a big film gets made, and then that triggers people to remember or even see things. And then you get more films, and you have a runaway feedback like that. I mean, Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. What was it? Condon's classificatory system? First encounters of the first kind, second kind, third kind.
Oh, that's Hynek. Yeah, that's Hynek.
Oh, Hynek. It was Hynek. Yeah,
Hynek. Yeah.
Yeah, but that had been around for quite a while, right?
Not really. No, I mean Hynek developed that he lays that out in his 1972 book, the UFO experience. That's where it all gets that. Now he'd been working on it. And it's something that he was talking about that others were aware of. He had been working on since at least, I think, the late 1960s. But he's the one who really publishes it, and it becomes, right, still to this day, it's the most common way which people talk about these kind of encounters. But before that, people were trying to come up with classification schemes to sort of talk about this stuff, and nothing ever gets agreed on. I mean, in many ways, we still talk about, unidentified flying objects. Of course, now people talk about UAP and unidentified anomalous phenomenon, and before that, it was flying saucers. But what's often forgotten is for a lot of this period of time, a lot of people didn't like this terminology, including the Air Force. But a lot of people were always looking for new language to talk about it. Some people talked about unidentified aerial objects, unidentified aerial phenomena, right? All sorts of rubrics are kind of used for this stuff. But Hynek is going to be the key figure for this close encounter language that's going to really sort of take off in the 70s and 80s.
Interesting. Yeah, the human mind seems to need some kind of classificatory system, like the Linnaean system for life, or the Kardashev scale. I think you mentioned the Russian cosmologist who classified extraterrestrial civilizations at different levels based on how much energy they consume. So a type 1 or level 1 would be using all the fossil fuels on a planet and then making the transition to renewables. And then Level 2 would be using this the sun system. Level 3 would be using all the energy from the galaxy, something like that. Of course, this is all assuming aliens are like us and they need the same kind of energy we need, and they build cities like we build cities, and they build solar panels like we build solar. So much reflecting how we think about energy and civilization.
Yeah, and us, right?
And ourselves,
how we think about us, because this is the part of it that I've got a colleague of mine who's working on the whole epistemology of thinking about aliens, and about all the quandaries about how it's almost inescapable for us, right, to get away from thinking about everything in earthbound terms. If they must, do they look like us? Do they have to feed? Do they have to breathe? All of these kind of basic assumptions we make get folded into those conversations, right? That's the stuff. That's where this stuff enters the world of science fiction, right? Because you've got to sort of speculate.
Yeah. Yeah, I always comment that the aliens are always like these bipedal primates with some gnarly stuff on their forehead, speaking English with a weird accent. Because basically it's driven by the wardrobe budget, right? Because you talk to evolutionary biologists, it's like, what are the chances the aliens are going to be bipedal primates? I mean, that's only happened, maybe a dozen times in the history of the billion species that have evolved on Earth. Although I should point out, Simon Conway Morris, the evolutionary theorist, argues for convergent evolution. There's only so many ways to structure a body. Like if you have a planet with an atmosphere and you want to fly, you have to have some kind of aerodynamic structure. It's going to be like a wing. And if you are on land, you have to have something like arms and legs to move around. Yeah. And if photons of light represent information about the environment, including survival, you're going to have something like eyes. And maybe it makes sense to have like all the sensory apparatus and the brain up on one end of the body and the waste disposal system at the other end of the body, and then some limbs to move around. You could get something like a bipedal dinosaur or whatever on some other planet. So that's an interesting debate.
No, I love that. That's very cool.
Yeah. Well, okay, so you do have a chapter, Journeys. To me, it seems like a slightly different topic, because the UFO stuff is stuff that's out there. The Journeys thing seems to be more of like what's in people's heads.
Yeah, the chapter on Journeys looks at the people who start saying, "I met the aliens." The phenomenon that begins pretty much with the early 1950s. George Adamski, again, is kind of the famous contactee in that regard. And the chapter ends with the famous Betty and Barney Hill case of the couple who are traveling in New Hampshire and lose their memories of having traveled for a period of time after seeing a UFO. And after some reconstruction, come to this idea that they'd been abducted by the aliens. So it's a period of time of about 10 years, about a decade between those two sort of moments here. And I've had people who've made that argument. I remember an astronomer telling me, I like what you're doing. I think it's really interesting. It seems to me that UFOs and alien contact are two ontologically different phenomena. They're two different phenomena. I said, I get that. But once again, socially, historically, you can't separate them because they were always folded together. They were seen as intimately connected. And in a way, the case of Betty and Barney Hill is a good example, because their incident, their experience is triggered by a UFO sighting, right? They see a UFO. They stop their car, they say, and they track and watch this UFO slowly approaching them. So UFOs always were sort of bound up in all of this stuff. But you're quite right. The journeys, the people who make the claims about contacting aliens was always seen as something very distinctive, categorically different than the other kinds of sightings and discussions that people were having. And it's why, for instance, in the 50s, people in the UFO world are really, really divided about how to deal with these folks who are coming forward saying, I met the aliens. There are some who are saying, let's listen to them. They have something to say. And there are other ufologists who are like, we want nothing to do with them. Donald Kehoe wanted, for instance, nothing to do with them. He thought they basically corrupted the message that he was trying to get out, that we needed to take this stuff seriously. He thought they were an embarrassment to the cause, right? But there were plenty of other people who viewed it differently.
Interesting. Yeah, again, it's that line of demarcation. I saw that with the kind of young Earth creationists as they kind of faded in the 90s, and then there was the rise of the intelligent design theorists who wanted nothing to do with those guys, you know, the young Earth creationists and the Duane Gishes, and the, you know, the Grand Canyon was carved in a week by the flood, you know, and so, and these guys go like, you know, this is embarrassing. We got to create a whole new field here that has nothing to do with that because they make us look bad. I think that's probably true in most fields like that.
Yeah.
I remember meeting Whitley Strieber in the green room at Bill Maher's show, his old show, Politically Incorrect. And I barely kind of knew who he was because his book had been out, Communion. Was that the name of his book?
Yeah, Communion. Yeah.
So in the green room, and we're just chatting. It's like, so what do you do when you're not, you know, writing books like this? He goes, well, I write science fiction and fantasy. I went, oh, okay. Sure you do. And this one is stamped nonfiction. Okay, that's the difference. Of course, that's my cynical interpretation. But since then, you know, I've been reading a lot about sleep paralysis. This is our best explanation for the, you know, aliens came to me in the night. Is these waking dreams that people have. And there's a lot more that we know about it now. Like maybe 3 to 5% of the population has these experiences that's called sleep paralysis because you're in a super deep sleep. So your body is very relaxed. The muscles are super relaxed. The interpretation of this is from an evolutionary perspective. If you're sleeping up in a tree and you're in a deep sleep, you don't want to be sleepwalking and fall out, right? So your body is super relaxed, doesn't move. So when they wake up in their dream, they feel like they can't move. They feel paralyzed. But the weird part about it is the sense presence in the room. And this is a weird phenomenon I've written about with like high altitude climbers, K2 climbers, the Himalaya guys, but also solo sailors, solo flyers. Anybody that spends a lot of time by themselves, they all of a sudden start seeing other presences right there with them. A lot of these high altitude climbers will talk about, you know, I was there in the tent because a lot of times you're just sitting there waiting for the storm to pass for a week. You know, and there's another person there and they're talking to them. They're having conversations with these people. So the brain is obviously capable of creating these other people. In the case of sleep paralysis, it's more of an amorphous, like a dark figure, almost like a ghost-like figure that's dark and mostly menacing, usually not friendly. And then they can't move. And if they can try to get something to move, like the little finger, or maybe their hand, fingers, and then wrist, and then you wake up, you start moving around. And then the presence goes away. We've published some stories about this in Skeptic. They're quite fascinating. Nothing to do with aliens, just this weird stuff that happens. So if you read the late Middle Ages, early modern period accounts of these, it's always these incubi and succubi that come into the bedrooms. Now it's aliens. So our interpretation is, you know, the experiences are real in people's minds. It's this neurological thing, whatever it is. And then the culture tells you, this is how you talk about it. This is what I think it was. You know, it was the aliens, it was the demons, or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, and I do talk about this in the book because, you know, you do have to sort of get at this issue. It was, I think, David Hufford who became famous for writing the book about what's called, he called it the old hag phenomenon or syndrome, because it's a very common thing of an old woman, and that you see this across cultures, and it's he always linked it to sleep paralysis as well. I mean, what I do in my case is I take a slightly different tack in that I talk about these different explanations for it and the debate about these kinds of things. But part of what I think for me was I think an important thing to talk about that I don't see a lot talked about when it came to alien abduction was how many different people have a part to play in talking about, in authoring the story that people end up stating happened to them, right? They have an experience, but that experience gets discussed with multiple people along the way. I've gone so far as to say I've yet to come across a single authored alien abduction claim. And by that I mean that people inherently talked about this experience that they had, were asked questions about it. They might have learned more about it over time, expanded on it over time, maybe changed some details, felt like they learned more. Some people go through hypnosis, and that adds another dimension. But so many times what it is other people have had some sort of role to play in teasing out information and in working with the person to help reconstruct it. And so as I put it, I don't make the argument that people are lifting things from movies and just putting them into their stories, but rather that what we have to start to figure out is how you move from whatever thing happened to somebody, whatever that experience was like, not just the phenomena, but the experience was like, and how that goes from this point to then this story that's told that now is kind of a complete story, right? How do you get from point A to point B? That seems to me an inherently social story. That's about story making. And again, this is not to say that the people who do this are liars or delusional or mentally ill. It's simply to say that this is what we all do with our experiences, right? We are storytellers, and we oftentimes need help telling those stories.
Yeah, you talked about Ted Bleecker or Blocher, however you pronounce his name.
I think it's Fred Bleecker, yeah.
279. Let me see if he did that study of the most common, or the top 500 sightings, something like that, was it? And I bring that to mind because now I can't find it. Roswell wasn't even on his list of like the top 500 sightings or whatever. It's like, so Roswell became a story later, decades later after the fact, when the culture was more ready to hear it, or, different things. Friedman, wrote that book. Was it his book or the,
Friedman was involved, and then Bill Moore was involved.
Right.
In it.
Bill Moore. Yeah. Right. The Roswell incident book. Yeah. And then the movie was made about it. Then it became, like in the 1980s, it became the Roswell incident.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Same thing with Area 51, right? Nobody back in the 1960s, or I think even the 70s, was talking about Area 51. That too is another one that sort of has to sort of come out much later, and then occupies this really, really prominent place, but only after decades, right?
Yeah. And so, back to the abductees, I forgot what I was going to say about that now. That they're reflecting their culture, but they're having real world experience. I've met a number of them, and I believe them when they tell me they had these experiences. So I guess the question is, well, what does the experience represent? And maybe we don't have to have an explanation for everything, back to the anomalies.
Right.
It's just,
It's
something like that.
I mean, the human, go back to, as something we were talking about earlier, sometimes it's just the I don't know is the only position you can sort of take, particularly oftentimes in an individual case. But, as a historian, it's hard for me not to look and read over the many centuries of all the stuff I've read and looked at, and not say, human beings are pretty remarkable and have had all sorts of remarkable experiences that I absolutely can't empathize with, right? I have no idea. I try my best to know what it would have been like to be a religious mystic, all right, in the Middle Ages. It's so far afield from my universe. Yeah. So the best I can do is have people like Jeff Kripal and people like that reconstruct it for me. But it's its own world, and the best I can do is to try to reconstruct it in some ways, to try to figure out how it works.
Kripal, he's interesting. He I think, does he have a book on like anomalous psychological experiences? Just thousands and thousands that people have had. Yeah. I mean, I've had weird things most people have had. I just had Sebastian Junger on the podcast. He wrote the Perfect Storm and other really best-selling books. His new book is In My Time of Dying. And it's about a near-death experience. He had this weird pancreatic aneurysm, and he was losing like pints of blood by the minute. And, rushed him to the OR and all this stuff. And And all of a sudden, his dad, who had been dead for 10 years, appears, and he's talking to him. It's like, what are you doing here? And he had no idea he was dying. He was just like lying there, and they're working on him. He has no idea. He's got this pain in his gut. And so, he goes on and on about that. And when it happens to you, I mean, he says, I'm an atheist. I'm not claiming I think there's an afterlife. This is not proof of anything. I'm just saying weird shit happens. And this was my experience. And then he has stuff on quantum physics, that you explained the double slit experiment. Then, it's like, well, I can't, nobody can, right? It's just weird. And, maybe it's something like that. Maybe it's not, who knows, and there's enough of those, I think that kind of catalog of weird stuff that happens to people, we do need to keep an open mind. I know I was going to ask you, since we were talking about Avi Loeb, another element of the story is Harvard astronomer Avi Loeb. Harvard astronomer, right? So Harvard psychiatrist John Mack says, all right, so speak to that. To what extent did that kind of push that in a more serious direction?
Oh, yeah. The credentialing of one's expertise becomes very critical in this historically. And what's kind of interesting is the UFO world, right? The people who've inhabited ufology both have been historically pretty skeptical about academics, right? They've been seen as closed-minded and biased and prejudiced, and in some cases even suspected of involvement with the government. The famous skeptic who I know Donald Menzel, was always accused of working for the CIA. I actually was actually accused of working for the CIA.
You were?
I must be doing that.
You're an agent of disinformation.
I was saying, if that's the case, damn it, I want my check.
That's right.
Because they have not been mailing them to me. But
just for the listeners, John Mack wrote that book on alien abductions, and at some point he started taking it literally, not like a literary truth or a mythical truth, but something that actually happened to these people.
Yeah, and I mean, with the case of Mack is complicated because he did say these people are talking about something authentic. This is real. This is not just a psychological phenomenon or the result of some psychopathology. But I will say that he was always kind of hedging his bets in the sense that because he, again, is another person whose philosophy was a very spiritual philosophy based on a kind of, again, I think it's called transpersonal psychology. It's a vision of personal enlightenment that's connected to a kind of a cosmic order of things, and thus creating a harmony that will bring you as a person in harmony with things that are higher than you, able to reach a certain spiritual enlightenment that will invariably, hopefully, reflect back on making the world a better place. So for him, it really seemed easy then for him to understand this stuff as real. And so I get when I read some of the archival stuff of his and read what he was working on, is he was a guy who was not very clear on how best to interpret all of these things, that he wasn't sure, as is Whitley Strieber, not at all convinced that these things are alien, that they could be some other kind of being, right, in the universe that we inhabit. Again, so a perspective that really leans more into the spiritual than it does in sort of the nuts and bolts aliens, as we were talking about. But yeah, with Mack and with Avi Loeb and people like that university affiliation, particularly when it's Harvard, as you said, with the newspaper article, when it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, and people often say it about me, right? It's amazing that a professor at Penn State University is actually writing about this stuff. That seems to lend it more credence because of the way we understand, right, credentials.
Yeah. And certainly harkens back to that different kind of community. So Mack became ensconced in that community of people, and as a empathetic psychiatrist working with patients, doesn't want to pass judgment. Whereas something like his colleague Carl Sagan, who basically confronted him about this stuff. And then he wrote about Mac in Demon Haunted World, 1996. Yeah. Pretty critical. And it's like, I guess maybe the charitable way to think about it is it depends on what the social pressures are for you to say something. For Carl is one of the founding members of Psychop and, the whole skeptical movement. I have to say, I just think this is nonsense, or I think it's real. Where someone like Mac could maybe say, I don't know. These people are genuine. I want to be empathetic. They believe something happened to them. A little bit like Dan Dennett's idea of belief in belief. I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist, but other people believe, and I believe that they believe, and maybe that has a kind of truth value in itself. Something like that.
Right. No, it's true. And you see this in general, in a sense that difference of opinion between Sagan and Mack is indicative really of something you see, and I talk a little bit about in the book, is the differences between people who are involved in clinical work, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, versus psychologists, social psychologists, experimental psychologists. We know that they can look at the same thing very differently. So we know things, for instance, like the idea of recovered memory, right? We know that clinicians tend to be more sympathetic to that idea than people who work in an experimental field where they're not working with patients. They don't develop close relationships with people. So I agree. I think one of the things that made John Mack so distinctive was because he was working from a clinician standpoint. He's a guy who inherently is supposed to be listening to people, right? That's your job, is to take people seriously. And you don't sit there and tell a client, this is nonsense, or knock it off, right? No, you sit there and say, I want to hear more. Tell me about it, right? He was a very gifted clinician by all measures, right? And very well loved, not only by the clients who saw him, but also by a lot of his colleagues. Yeah.
Yeah, it was tragic death, right? Didn't he get run over by a car in London?
Yeah,
walking on the
I think it was a lorry.
He stepped he looked the wrong way, something like
right,
that.
And I think the lorry driver was also drunk at the time.
Is that right? Oh,
yeah, I think
that.
it was, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right, let's look to your conclusion. Where to, where from, where for, right? So things got triggered again in 2017 with the Leslie Kean New York Times article. And then those 4 or 5 videos that we've all seen a gazillion times because it's the only ones they have, and they play them over and over and over. Every Tucker Carlson Fox News show had the same videos, right? Yeah. But and then the name change. First it was unidentified aerial phenomenon, and then because of that one video where it looks like the blob goes underneath the ocean and back up, then it became unidentified anomalous phenomenon. So again, UAP is a less pejorative, let's say, or loaded term. So I get that. Sure, just change the name so we're more objective about it. Do you think that something's going to come of this, again, with the congressional hearings and someone like Marco Rubio that says, let's get to the bottom of this? Now, I don't think Marco thinks it's aliens. I think he's like, well, what if the Chinese do have drones? We know they're working on stuff. We know, they're not super friendly to us. So maybe we should look into it. I've often thought, okay, I would if Marco went in, but so here's the problem. What if whoever it is in the dark deep state is running this program? All right, Marco, we're going to show you the alien craft or show you what we have. They take him in there and he goes, oh my God, we can't tell the public about this. Right, of course you can't. So then he comes out and goes, nothing to see here, folks. And you're like, oh no.
No,
I mean, who could we trust? Maybe you and I get an invitation, but I don't think that's going to happen.
No way. Now, and that's, of course, people who know a little bit about defense. I suppose people like Garrett Graff would tell you, people like Marco Rubio probably don't have clearance to get to certain things. That includes the congressman last summer who were railing against not getting access to things. We talk about skepticism. I'll tell you, the first group of people I'm always skeptical about are politicians. Okay, they're playing they're doing a dance for constituents. So some of these things I think are just a lot of performance on their part. But I think some of them are genuine and wanting to get to the bottom of things. But as you say, I think a lot of that is about maybe concerns about how money is being spent, by the Pentagon more than anything else. I think what Congress and what Arrow are doing are one sort of thing. And it is not probably going to be much different than what we saw back in the old heyday of Project Blue Book under the Air Force. It's going to be involving a lot of classified material that you're never going to be able to hear about. You're not supposed to hear about, not supposed to get access to, at least not right now. And may get released later on down the road, many years from now. I think something interesting could take place would be and this maybe shows you my bias as an academic. I think the more interesting story has always been about NASA's interest in this. The fact that NASA, who deal with civilian scientists, right? That to me is the interesting stuff. That they've put their stamp of approval on the idea that civilian scientists should actually be finding ways to look into this in a more rigorous fashion. That to me is the future. Now, how that's going to play out, researchers, we need money to study this stuff. So if you want us to do it, we're going to need to have some funding sources for that. And as yet, I'm not sure that's in the pipeline.
Yeah, again, there's always these struggles between openness in a democracy and classified information that we really don't need to know. So let's say someone like you sends out a FOIA request regarding some sighting or whatever, and you get back something that says we have nothing to show you. And do they really just have nothing because there's nothing to it, or is it really it was the next version of a stealth fighter and we can't tell you about it? How would you ever know?
Yeah, no. How would you know? Exactly.
So frustrating.
Yeah,
and then like the Grush testimony, it's like, okay, but wait, he saw the spacecraft? No, he didn't see anything. He knows somebody that saw it. Well, who is it? Well, he can't tell us. Well, okay, so frustrating. Yeah, but we might get to the bottom of it with more congressional here. Okay, this is a year and a half ago now. So when's it coming? And my sense is it's never coming. This is the back to where we started in your book. This is part of the whole thing, is that we'll never actually know. That's what keeps it going.
No, and it is, right. I mean, the story of the UFO phenomenon has always been about people who have some evidence, but the evidence is always a little ambiguous, or it never really, comes to fruition. We never really see what we're supposed to see, or there's something that gets in the way of learning about X, Y, or Z. That aspect of things, of course, lends people to be, of course, deeply skeptical about it, but it also, of course, keeps the mystery alive, right? It serves both functions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when you read about the history of the CIA in the 50s and 60s and rigging elections, assassinating foreign leaders, and, having their own Air Force and development of all these secret technologies, like, oh, well, okay. And the mind control, MK Ultra mind control program is like, oh, our government was doing this, or the COINTELPRO, the FBI's spy program on civil rights activists like Martin Luther King. Like, wait, these are American citizens protected by the Constitution, and our government was doing what?
Yeah.
So that's what always makes me wonder, like, okay, in 20, 30 years from now, what are we going to find out that was happening in the early 2020s that we didn't know about?
Right. Yep. And that's to be expected.
Yeah. All right. All right, Greg, thanks so much.
Well, thanks, Michael. This was great.